So a pretty enormous 40k rules update today. The Dark Angel's Deathwing got nuked from orbit, there's big nerfs to the Imperial Guard, Tau broadsides get core back, and it really looks like Games Workshop haven't helped out the Thousand Sons much at all. Loads of stuff to unpack here, so let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's latest big balance update for Warhammer 40k. Really quite a big document with a lot of nudges to various different armies, a ton of rules added and a ton of rules removed, so let's see what we've got. This one is going to be the last balance data slate of 9th edition Warhammer 40k. I guess that will make this one the finishing touches on 9th edition, so if you're playing 9th edition from here on out, it will be with this rule set. I don't expect Games Workshop will be publishing anything else. I'd say broadly speaking the game isn't doing too badly at the moment for interfaction balance. Obviously there's still units that are stronger and weaker. I'd argue though that there's only a few armies that really need a decent boost or toning down a bit, and GW seems to have at least tried to help or nerf at least a fair few of these, though there's a few odd omissions and some weird choices in here. This one is basically the rules balance data slate. They were never going to mess with points in this one unfortunately, and that perhaps does tie their hands a little bit as to how they can really change armies. Sometimes armies that need a small buff or nerf, it just isn't really all that easy to do with rules changes. You don't really want to be creating a whole extra rule system for an army but only make it a very weak one. I feel like that might have guided some of their changes a bit. Going through it though, there really is quite a lot. There's the main balance data slate itself, plus a small FAQ for Arcs of Omen, making a few small clarifications, though I'd argue nothing major. For the main game, there's not much for the core rules changes, there's just one core secondary. They've decided to change the category of the Abhor the Witch one, the Anti-Psyker secondary. Then going through the list of factions, for Space Marines Codex Warfare has been nerfed, Deathwatch got their unique secondary buffed, plus some better more flexible doctrines. Dark Angels have had their Terminator durability buff basically outright removed, which is kind of crazy. The Genestealer Cults have had a nerf to their secondary Brood Swarm, which was kind of auto-take. The Imperial Guard have had a big nerf to their Catachan Las Cells and the mortal wounds from it, plus their Finial standard is a good deal less powerful than it was. There's a couple of things that have regained core, both the Tau broadsides and the Drukhari, Talos and Kronos have both got it back. That makes them far more interesting choices again. The Tyranids have also had some nerfs removed as well. They removed the Hive Tyrant nerfs, plus the one for the adaptive traits. They're perhaps quite nice to have back, given how many nerfs that the armies had in general. The Custodes have just had a very small nerf with combining two stratagems. They're broadly unchanged though. And talking of unchanged things, perhaps the most notable ones are things like World Eaters and Demons, which haven't seen any changes. The Iron Hands haven't really had anything outside of Codex Warfare. And on the bottom end of the power spectrum, Thousand Sons, bar that secondary change, haven't had anything, and neither have they chosen to address armies like Imperial Fists or Raven Guard. Loads of stuff here, so let's go through in detail, and we'll take each army in turn. First up for the core secondary change, there's Abhor the Witch. This one was the one in the Warpcraft section, and it was the one that you took if you didn't have any Psykers, and if instead of casting powers, you instead wanted to purge them with Flamers instead. I'd say arguably it's nerfed a bit, as previously it wasn't really competing with any other secondaries, you could just have it as an addition if you wanted to. Now though it's going to be directly competing against the Purge the Enemies section, as it's been moved to there, so you might well not be able to have both say Abhor the Witch and killing characters, which would kind of stack pretty powerfully. I thought this was a bit of a strange change to be honest. It seems that from their video update that went alongside this, they basically said that they did this to help out Grey Knights and Thousand Sons in particular. Both of these guys will suffer when this secondary is taken against them, as it usually racks up a fair amount of points, so having this potentially outcompete other ones might just reduce the scores that other armies get against them. Still though, I'm not really massively convinced that this is going to help them out very much. I guess you could maybe stack it with the character killing one, which wouldn't be the worst. I kind of feel like stacking Assassinate with one that also relies on you killing characters might just be a bit risky though. If your opponent does manage to protect a couple of their characters all game long, you're going to lose out on score big time. You're kind of gambling on blasting through their front lines and being able to hunt down their leaders, basically banking on winning the damage game. It does seem perhaps a bit weird to leave other armies with no choices whatsoever in one of the 5 secondary categories now. I feel like it was an interesting kind of balance to not having any Psykers. Overall, I'd guess that this one's probably not going to change all that much. I feel like it's not enough to help out the Thousand Sons from where they are at the moment. Going through specific factions, first up we have the Space Marines, and their only real change was to the Codex Warfare secondary. Their other Dataslate stuff from January does remain though. Codex Warfare was one that definitely needed addressing, as for some reason it gave you double points for the Devastator Doctrine kills. I thought they'd just take the Devastator Doctrine and put it down to 1 victory point like the rest, but it seems like they've basically reverted it to a previous version of the secondary, where you can only score a maximum of 5 victory points for each of the 3 doctrines. Really quite a big nerf to this, and I feel like this one's just generally not going to get taken for Space Marines after this. It does perhaps hit Dark Angels and Iron Hands a bit more than most, as they both really like to take this and just farm out the kills in Devastator. Now though, I kind of feel like it's just not really useful for just about any Space Marine army. You'd have to be very balanced and be aiming to get a whole bunch of kills in all of the doctrines, otherwise you're going to score low. They did FAQ it that also states that any stratagems and things that allow a unit to count as being in a different doctrine also count as being in a different doctrine for this. Again though, that's probably not going to change the most things. Maybe it just seems like it's got a bit of overspill if it's also going to hit other Marine lists that might want to have scored this in the tactical doctrine perhaps. I feel like it's not really necessary to hit the Salamanders and Ultramarines that way. I feel like perhaps just toning down the Devastator Doctrine 1 to 1 victory point might have been enough, or even just placing a cap on it like maybe 10 victory points or something like that, so that if you're just sitting in Devastator all game you can't max it. Otherwise though, that is the only change for Space Marines in general. They haven't messed around with the order in which you can pick doctrines or anything like that. They've still got those objectives which you can hold and then move on, and there weren't any changes to those Desolation squads which did take down that tournament recently. They're still going to be very strong for multiple chapters. Perhaps receiving one of the biggest direct nerfs of this entire update though are the Dark Angels. Currently one of the strongest armies in the game, with around about 58% wins currently, both the Deathwing and the Ravenwing having their merits. It seems that Games Workshop have just absolutely decided to make Deathwing way worse though. They've just basically removed their transhuman physiology rule that they get all the time outright. This meant that basically any of their Terminators could only be wounded on a 4+, and made them enormously durable, particularly combined with other buffs like that Pennant of Remembrance or Apothecaries. That combined with Rites of War, great support, and their own super flexible datasheet that can give you Psychic Denials, Thunderhammers, Storm Shields, and Cyclone Missile Launchers, and you were in for a good time. Now though, the transhuman physiology is just gone. I was wondering if they might perhaps weaken it down to mini transhuman, something like can only be wounded on a 3+, but no, they just decided to outright remove it. I certainly expect to see far fewer Terminators, and this is also a nerf to Dark Angel's characters as well. Again, they're all going to be far easier to kill. It does seem though that they haven't really done much to address Ravenwing tactics. I'd argue that they're perhaps just about equally strong as the Deathwing at the moment. Permanent Devastator Doctrine, Fast Movement, and the Jink rule all stack up. My guess is that Dark Angel's lists all remain pretty strong, though they're going to have a far greater focus on Ravenwing units and maybe the odd Desolation squad as well, as opposed to blocks of Deathwing Terminators. We might still see some potentially, but I guess that they're going to be a lot more rare. Overall, it's definitely a nerf to the Dark Angels. I'd be surprised if their win rate doesn't drop a fair bit as a result, though I feel like the Ravenwing will probably still keep them pretty competitive. On the other end of the spectrum in Space Marine land, we've got the Deathwatch. They're currently one of the weakest armies in 40k, with only 36% wins currently, and Games Workshop have given them 2 buffs. First up, they can now change doctrines to each one that they choose on every turn. This was one of the possible changes that I talked about in the speculation video before. I just felt like it seemed like a very sensible choice for them, as still keeps the flexibility for them, something that they'd kind of sort of lost a bit when Space Marine doctrines got a lot more flexible in general. At least they're not really arguably directly worse than other Space Marines. You can have 5 turns of Devastator Doctrine or 5 turns of Assault if you want to, which is kind of interesting. Otherwise, they got a small buff to their secondary objective, the Call Order one, where you have to try and eliminate 3 enemy battlefield roles from the table. This one still gets you 5 victory points for each one of those battlefield roles that you purge off the table. Now though, you also get a bit of a halfway credit for them as well. If at the end of the game you haven't wiped that battlefield roll out, but you've killed at least 1 unit of them, you still get 3 victory points rather than 0. It means that it might not be too hard to score something like 9 victory points from this. Depending on what sort of enemies and battlefield roles that you're playing though, it still might not be all that easy. Overall, between the 2 of them, I suspect that this probably isn't going to be enough to really help them out and make them that interesting of an army again. A few more points from the secondary doesn't hurt, and a bit more AP when you need it from their doctrines is nice. I feel like they're still going to be lacking a fair bit of raw power though, and the points cost and things on their kill teams might have been an easier way to do this, though of course this isn't the points update. I still would not expect them to be standout Space Marines, probably one of the weaker ones. Next up we've got the Genestealer Cult, again maybe one of the contenders for one of the strongest armies in 40k, around about 58% wins, and I feel like Games Workshop has made a pretty reasonable change for them, to be honest, nerfing their Brood Swarm secondary, basically knocking off 2 of the ways that you can score it out of the fairly crazy 5 that it had previously. This secondary I think was arguably one of the very easiest in the game and tended to score incredibly well provided you brought the list that can do it. Previously you could get up to 5 victory points a turn with this, outnumbering the foe and then also outnumbering them in your own deployment zone, the midfield and the enemy one, plus a bonus one if you did all 4 of those. In the Dataslate they've toned it down really quite a lot. They've removed the one for just outnumbering your foe outright on the board. I guess that was a bit all or nothing, and they've also removed the bonus victory point as well. I feel like this one seems pretty sensible given that Genestealer Cult's way of playing was generally just to outscore the foe. I feel like their raw army power maybe isn't anything that needs enormous amounts doing about it, so turning one secondary into an auto-include good one into a bit more of a situational pick seems fairly good. They'll still be very powerful on things like engage on all fronts if they want to do that instead, or the ambush one that they have. I still suspect that the Genestealer Cult will be one of the game's stronger factions, though I feel like they'll be less far ahead than they were. Next up we've got some nerfs for the Imperial Guard, currently a strong army with around about a 52% win rate currently. Kind of interesting that Games Workshop chose to target them with not 1 but 2 different nerfs here. I guess part of the reasoning could be that they're a bit overrepresented at top tables and tournaments and things like that, plus just in general the Kazakin last cells rule did feel like it was a bit more of a rules loophole and written a bit differently to most other similar stratagems in 40k. The overcharged last cell stratagem was 1 CP and often done on Kazakin. It meant that every 6 to wound got you a mortal wound, and you could potentially get a lot more 6s to wounds by using Born Soldiers and potentially the Born Soldiers specific stratagem and maybe Lord Solar rerolls for good measure. Between that little lot and the Barbican's key to teleport them into place, you could easily be handing out 6 mortal wounds to multiple different units. You just needed to divide your fire a bit, and you'd also get a fair amount of stuff from the regular las guns as well. Now though, they've just tweaked the wording very slightly. The damage output is now just capped at 6 mortal wounds per phase total. Means that you're not getting potentially 18 mortal wounds out of these guys if you roll well. I feel like it's probably sensible, to be honest. It was an option that was just a bit on the weird side. If you went second and you couldn't counter them, then you might lose a good chunk of your army for no real counterplay. Otherwise, if you went first and either had fast movers or artillery, you could greatly reduce their damage output before they even got to strike. It seems that that's not all though, as they've also nerfed the Finial than Emradesh First standard, basically an auto-include banner relic that seems to crop up in just about every Cadian command squad, giving you a rather impressive stack of core shooting buffs, ignoring any modifiers to hit, including for things like advancing weapons or moving and shooting with heavy weapons, but also ignoring feel no pain and damage caps, say things that you might get on Abaddon the Despoiler. It definitely was a crazy relic, though the core units in the army are maybe a little bit more limited than the big guns. The change to this one is that it now no longer ignores modifiers, so maybe a bunch of the use cases for it are a little bit more limited. It now seems to be a bit more of a fairly specific thing that you can include in your army if you desperately want to counter something like a damage cap unit like Abaddon or Ghazghkull, or things like Catan shards. Having this around means that those units are a lot easier to shoot off the table, and that might be kind of tricky if you had a pure shooting army otherwise. Finally, they also clarified inflexible command in an FAQ. They said that the secondary only affects units that are on the battlefield. There's no argument that you can make now for units off the battlefield breaking it. I think that felt the intuitive way to play it anyway, to be honest. Overall, I feel like these changes maybe aren't the worst. They hit a couple of the auto-include things that did seem just a bit overtuned in the Guard Codex, and they are one of the stronger armies in the game. I do think that it's maybe just a bit weird though that Guard get hit when higher win rate armies like Demons and World Eaters didn't get touched. Maybe just feels a little bit inconsistent. Overall, I do suspect that Guard will be a bit weaker, but probably not by loads. They've still got a whole load of strong things to bring to the table, but I feel like there might be just a little bit more focus on things like Russes and armor now, with a couple of nerfs to Kazakin and core gunning platforms. Next up, we've got a small change to the Drukhari. They're now one of the slightly weaker armies in 40k with around about 45% wins. I feel like GW do continue to take a look at their nerfs that they've given armies over the past few data slates, and it looks like they've decided that core is a good thing to put on Drukhari, Talos and Kronos once more, both units that just aren't really being played in massive numbers at the moment. The initial nerf was done when Drukhari had basically been dominating tournaments for around about a year. Some people have been running an excessive amount of pain engines plus a whole bunch of racks, though I'd say that since then a whole load of other strong books in Warhammer 40k have come out, and it's perhaps reached the point where they're not going to be a problem anymore. For the most part, Drukhari lists that I've seen have tended to be at least fairly sparing on the pain engines ever since. You certainly don't see that many people spamming loads of them, though I certainly wouldn't be too surprised to see a whole bunch more now they've got core once more and can get things like +1 toughness from a homunculus, plus a bit more stratagem access, maybe even some rerolls from a real space raid Archon. Overall, I wouldn't be too surprised if this makes Drukhari a bit more of a powerful army. Seems at least fairly reasonable that Pain Engine Heavy Covens could be one of the best builds now. Will be interesting to see if they pop up a bit more. Otherwise, no major changes. They still have their previous nerfs to the Artists of Flesh and Dark Technomancers. Continuing with the removal of previous nerfs, the Tyranids have looked out here, getting a couple of fairly major things reversed. They'd been dominating 9th edition since their codex dropped, though in Arcs of Omen they got hit by all manner of crazy nerfs, loads of points cost increases, and some fairly painful things with Spore Mines and their flyer. Now they're certainly on the lower end of the power spectrum, around about 45% wins, borderline on the low side, so it looks like Games Workshop have chosen to revert a couple of their more minor nerfs, hopefully to put them somewhere back more in the midfield. The first one is a pair of nerfs to Hive Tyrants. If you're using a Hive Tyrant, then they had to be your Warlord, and if the Warlord was slain, then you lose Synaptic Imperatives for the rest of the game. It meant that killing the Hive Tyrant could be a really big deal for the Tyranid army, and losing it unexpectedly could be kind of killer. I guess GW have decided that this wasn't really necessary now they've also had points nerfs and things. I still think that Hive Tyrants were being run pretty consistently competitively. A lot more walking ones about, though the winged one with the Reaper Obliterax still sees a bit of play. I think this one's a fairly feels-good change that means that you're not punished for taking one of the biggest and most exciting bugs. Otherwise though, and perhaps the more exciting one, is that they've removed the nerf to the adaptive part of the Hive Fleet trait, meaning that you can now select them again to counter your opponent's army somewhat if it makes sense to. That was part of the perhaps slightly weaker initial Tyranid nerfs that they had, and I feel like that was one of the ones that was most complained about, as it certainly was helpful, but I'm not sure it was so helpful to the extent where it gave the army an enormous power boost, and this was the thing that was the problem. It is really quite a fun and fluffy rule, and I think that Tyranid players will welcome its return. It was just a bit sad when that fun adaptive trait rule got taken away, as opposed to just having the unit's datasheets costed right. In general, I feel like both of these are helpful, probably not to the extent where they're going to majorly turn the fortunes of the Tyranids around, though I do feel that they're probably heading a little bit more for the midfield than borderline towards the bottom of the meta like they are at the moment. Next up, we've got perhaps a slightly surprising buff for the Tau Empire. Currently kind of mid-tier, around about 48% wins currently. Again, they're a codex that's eaten all sorts of nerfs since the codex initially came out. Broadsides were being played at least a fair bit, and they got hit by a double whammy of nerfs at the same time, both points increasing and losing core. But now they've gained core back, I feel like they will be very interesting again. They're now going to give a bunch of the powerful core buffs that the tower have another viable target, things like the 5+ Feel No Pain from the Ethereal, and a couple of the Crisis Commander type buffs, things like the rerolls, Warlord traits, and maybe even Shadow Sun's full rerolls. Particularly with Crisis Suits going up in points again, I feel like these guys will see some play. I guess the question will be whether or not they can outcompete things like Riptides and Hammerheads. My guess would be that they are going to make a decent appearance though, a whole load of them appearing in lists. Overall seems like a reasonable strength boost to Tau, probably heading a bit more towards the top tier from mid tier maybe. Finally, for major changes to the factions, we have the Adeptus Custodes. They had a very strong start in Arcs of Omen with around about 53% wins currently. It seems that as a result Games Workshop haven't chosen to do too much with them, but again mess around with their stratagems just a little bit. What they've done is basically said that you can't use both their transhuman physiology rule, arcane genetic alchemy, and the Emperor's Auspex to turn off rerolls both on the same unit at the same time. My guess would be that this might have been a bit reactive to try and stop any sort of enormous durability Death Star of a unit, maybe a block of 5 or more Custodian Guard or really big units of Wardens from using both of those and just being super hard to remove for a turn or two. Unless you were using a big units to focus those on though, I'm not sure if this is really going to be the biggest deal in the world. I wouldn't really expect it to affect the power of Custodes all that much. I think they'll still be absolutely fine despite this change. That's the vast majority of the changes, but as I mentioned, I was quite surprised to see a few armies basically untouched, World Eaters and Demons perhaps being two of them, particularly as in one of their updates they did say that they wanted to try and tone down the top armies, but then also make sure that the ones just under them aren't going to rise up and just be the new best thing. And the ones in this sort of range will definitely be World Eaters and Chaos Demons, currently having wins of around about 56% each, perhaps just on the borderline of whether Games Workshop considers them problem armies outside of their 45 to 55% target. I feel like perhaps for both of these it would have been easier to rebalance them with points as opposed to slight nerfs. You wouldn't really want to be doing anything too massively crazy to the faction, like giving them an entire army-wide rule nerf. I guess things like maybe tweaks to secondaries might not have been the worst thing, or maybe for the World Eaters toning down one of their Blood Tithe abilities. I feel like perhaps small points nerfs to their most commonly played units though might have been the best way to go. They wouldn't need anything excessive, I don't think. Otherwise, in the high win rate sort of brackets, I'm kind of surprised not to see anything at all for Iron Hands specifically. I guess they did have Codex Warfare changed, so that's likely to cost them a fair few victory points, but still they were certainly solidly in the top tier of 40k factions. Win rates are around about 57%, and interesting that they were kind of on a level playing field with Dark Angels more or less. Dark Angels got an absolutely massive rules change when Iron Hands basically got away with it. I did kind of wonder whether Games Workshop might have limited Devastator Doctrine to 2 or 3 turns perhaps. It does seem though that Iron Hands might well be set to be one of the most powerful Codex Space Marine chapters, at least out of the less divergent bunch. On the other side of the power scale, I feel like perhaps the biggest losers out of this data slate are things like the Thousand Suns and the Imperial Fists. Thousand Suns are definitely a touch out of their ideal win rate, down at 52 or 53%. The only real thing that they've received is the Abhor the Witch stratagem being toned down. I feel like that this just really isn't enough to do anything massively meaningful for them. Any army that they were fighting against that had a Psyker wasn't going to take it anyway, and the ones that don't have Psykers still can take it. They might just potentially be passing up something like Assassinate. I feel like maybe a buff to their own secondaries would probably have been in order just to help them out a bit if they didn't want to go further. Otherwise, Imperial Fists and Raven Guard basically get looked over again. Games Workshop does seem to just not really care about balancing the individual sub-factions unless they're actually causing problems. I feel like something nice for Imperial Fists would have been quite nice with the closing strokes of 9th edition, but it seems like they're not getting anything this time. Otherwise, there are a whole bunch of armies that are on the lower end of the power scale, things like Chaos Space Marines, Death Guard, Admech and Blood Angels, and there are a few others not far from this. I feel like if they were trying to be a bit more far-reaching, they might have seen some minor buffs for these guys. Again, the points changes might have helped more so than rules. It feels like they might have just got a bit unlucky compared with things like Drukhari, Tau and Tyranids, who all had previous nerfs that Games Workshop could reverse. So overall, for the last balanced data slate of 9th edition, I still generally say that it's broadly positive stuff, but maybe just a few weird choices, and some things getting addressed a lot less than I might have expected. For the more positive things, at least things seem to be going broadly in the right kind of way. I feel like the Genestealer Cult secondary change was quite good, and the Deathwatch Doctrine buff was pretty nice as well. I think that looking over the prior nerfs and removing ones that make sense is also very good. For things that maybe felt just a little bit odder, I feel like it was perhaps a little bit harsh just to utterly nuke the Deathwing. I feel like swapping it out for something like Mini Transhuman might have been a bit more restrained. That still would have been a massive downgrade. Otherwise, no changes for World Eaters and Demons was maybe a little bit odd given their logic and what they said before about trying to address the slightly less powerful big factions. The guard changes I feel like are maybe kind of sensible, but maybe targeted to an army that's just doing a little bit worse than some of the competition. And I would probably argue that Deathwatch and Thousand Suns, despite being perhaps the main targets of Games Workshop's buffs, I don't think they've really got enough to make them that good. In terms of changes to the current meta and who's best, I'd guess that things won't enormously change in 40k. I'd guess that the gap might have closed between Dark Angels and Genestealer Cult and the rest of the armies. I still feel like they'll probably be joining things like World Eaters, Demons and Iron Hands though, for vying for the top factions of 40k. Dark Angels list, I'd expect to see a lot more Raven Wing though. Otherwise, on the lower end, I feel like Chaos Marines, Deathwatch and Thousand Suns might be some of the weaker armies, and of course the Space Marine chapters that didn't get addressed. In any case, it's a whole load to process. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Which bits of this do you think are good and bad, and is it a fitting last big update to 9th edition? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k updates coming. I do tend to post Games Workshop's news and rules updates. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.